guys, this is history for Thursday, the history reading for Thursday. It is the chapter 24, part 2. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this one. It's called the convict settlement. And convicts are people who have been convicted of a crime and they go to jail or prison. So we're going back a little bit in time from where we just ended with Captain Cook dying. While Cook sailed south, England lost North America. Now England had no American colonies, no American tobacco, and nowhere to send its prisoners. For years, Britain had been running out of jail space for all its prisoners, so judges had begun to send thieves, murderers, and swindlers to America for punishment. These criminals would travel to the colonies and work for a farmer or a plantation owner until their sentences were over. But now the American states refused to take England's criminals. Where would all of these prisoners go, right? We don't want to have to take care of your prisoners. The English government bought ancient ships, too old to sail, and moored them in rivers. So they would anchor them down and moor them in rivers where they wouldn't move anywhere. Prisoners were sent on board these hulks. This was their prison. They were filthy, damp, dark, and filled with rats and insects. Thousands of prisoners died in the hulks. But there were still too many for England's jails. And when the English remembered New South Wales, and then the English remembered New South Wales, 10 years after the War of Independence, 11 ships filled with supplies, jailers, and prisoners headed south for Australia. They were ordered to build a new colony in this land claimed by Cook, a colony of prisoners. So this land that Captain Cook found, they were going to use the land to keep their prisoners. The continent of Australia was about to become England's jail. No one wanted to be sentenced to Australia. Australia had no cities, no ports, no ships. Mysterious people called Aborigines lived there and might not be friendly. And Australia was so far away that a criminal sentenced to serve 7 years would never come home, because who's going to pick them up after 7 years? One judge sentencing a criminal to be sent on this first voyage to Australia announced, "I sentence you, but to what I do not know. Perhaps to storm and shipwreck, perhaps to infectious disorder, perhaps to famine, perhaps to be massacred by savages, perhaps to be devoured by wild beasts." They didn't know enough about Australia. They just knew it was a lot of land where they could send their prisoners. But the first prisoner of the Australian prison colony, Arthur Phillip, didn't intend to let the men and women on his 11 ships be massacred or devoured. Phillip was a small man, dark-haired, quick and energetic, and persistent. When he landed at Botany Bay, he was in charge of 1,000 people, 3/4 of them convicted criminals. Many were women and children, sent to Australia because they had stolen a loaf of bread or a pair of shoes. Many were too sick to work. None of them really wanted to build a colony which would serve as their own prison. Arthur Phillip was determined that they would build a colony and that the colony would prosper. But he could see that Botany Bay was the wrong place to settle. There was swamp all around and no fresh water. He ordered the whole group to move further up the coast to a cove where there was fresh water and flat land. He named it Sydney Cove, after an English government official. And then he set to work building the colony of Sydney. You guys are familiar with Sydney, Australia, right? Most of the prisoners were city folk who didn't know how to tend animals or grow crops. They couldn't even cut down trees for houses. Their tools, made to chop soft English wood, bounced off the iron-hard Australian tree trunks, and the prison guards refused to work side by side with the prisoners. They were only willing to guard them and issue orders. So Arthur Phillip made some of the convicts themselves into colony leaders. The prisoners worked to build roads and huts. They pulled the plows themselves because there were no horses. So this was very, very labor-intensive work that they were doing to build a colony off this huge land that had nothing besides the Aborigines, which are the native people of that land. But despite all their hard work, the colony almost starved to death. Almost 3 years later, no English ship had arrived with fresh supplies. The prisoners hadn't been able to grow enough food for themselves. They didn't really know, right? They weren't farmers. Arthur Phillip sent half of the colony to a distant island where they might find fish and birds to eat. He announced that everyone else would get only half of their usual rations. Starving prisoners started to steal food. Philip, afraid that all the food would disappear, ordered the offenders flogged. So that's whipped. Finally, a ship came into view over the horizon. It was an English ship bringing more prisoners and more food. Sydney was saved from starvation. But the ship had brought no instructions for Arthur Phillip. He had hoped that he might be allowed to return to England. Instead, he stayed, reading shiploads of convicts, arranging to send ships to Calcutta for extra food, ordering fruit trees and vines brought from Africa, forcing the prisoners to keep working in the fields. Despite the starvation and the hard work, some of the prisoners realized that life in Australia was actually better than life back in England. In England, they had been beggars with no way to get land of their own. But here, if they worked hard, Arthur Phillip would give them a farm of their own. The first convict to earn a farm, James Roos, got 40 acres. Hey, it's like our Fiddler Jones poem, 40 acres. A thief named Simeon Lord spent 15 years in the Sydney colony and rose to be a wealthy trader with his own estate. So if they were working and producing and using the land the way that Arthur wanted them to, he would give them land and they were able to use it for their own. A forger named Francis Greenway became Sydney's first architect, designing dozens of new buildings. Slowly, the colony began to prosper. 4 years after the prisoners arrived at Botany Bay, free settlers started to come to Australia. So not just prisoners, but people who were like, wait, this land might have something to offer. Hundreds of Englishmen and women decided they would be better off trying to scratch a living from Australia's red land than starving to death from poverty in England. Many of the convicts who had finished their sentences decided to stay in Australia and take up farming. Settlers moved inland and grazed sheep on the vast plains of Australia. These settlers were called squatters because they didn't buy their land, they just built houses on it and claimed it. Squatters could make good money sending wool to London to sell. But life as a squatter wasn't easy. Squatters had to fight off burning sun, drought, unexpected floods, and loneliness. There were no doctors, no stores, no towns. Squatters only got their mail 2 times per year. When the supply wagons came, there was little else to do, and so they drank. More rum was brought to Australia than any other kinds of food, drink, or more merchandise. So rum is a form of alcohol. And because so many more men than women were convicted of crimes, there were 3 men for every woman in Australia. Australia needed women. A committee in London was formed to send young women to Australia for only £5. Women who were too poor to find English husbands often went. So they could get there for, it only cost them £5, and then they could be taken to England to find a husband. Philip was finally allowed to return to England in 1792. He left a colony of 4,221 people behind him. 3,099 were convicts. Wow. Over the next 80 years, 160,000 convicts and many free people would come to Australia. Eventually, 5 English colonies would lie across Australia. But although English Australia prospered, the native people of Australia were pushed out of their homelands. Arthur Phillip had ordered the convicts of Sydney to live in peace with the Aborigines. But any convict who killed an Aborigine would be hanged. But despite this, the convicts stole foods and tools from the Aborigines. Squatters grazed their sheep on Aboriginal hunting grounds. And as English Australia grew, the land of the Aborigines shrank. When Arthur Phillip landed in Botany Bay, 300,000 Aborigines lived in Australia. By the time that Great Britain claimed all of Australia for itself, fewer than 80,000 remained. All right, so you guys will have questions to answer with this. Please answer them using your book. If you are just guessing your answers, you are definitely it's showing, and I am marking you down. But this was an interesting story. How many of you knew that Australia was formed by convicts? All right, have a great day, guys.